So hello, everybody. It's Ruth O'Donnell here from the Foot Nerd program, and we are going to record episode 1 of the Happiness podcast. So I have my best friend here with me, who's also my partner, Matthew Gervase, and we are going to talk about the 5 pillars of health. In the Foot Nerd program, foot nerds who embark on the year-long journey of trying to reclaim their own health through studying deeply sleep, movement, food, mindfulness, and community. Um, we unpack each of these subjects and we do a personal experiment in our own life in each of these subjects in order to be our own citizen scientist. A citizen scientist is somebody who takes the idea of science and applies a hypothesis to their own life and sees what happens. So the reason why I have Matthew here today is because he has a unique perspective on these subjects, and we talk about it a lot. So I'm getting ready to actually finish the Foot Nerd program and graduate in the next month. And so because we live together, he helps me work through a lot of the ideas. So happiness has been big on our list lately because I have the opportunity to talk to a lot of foot nerds and people in general about their lives and how they feel and what is healthy and how much sleep they get and is the food they're eating healthy and are they getting enough connection in community and so on and so forth. There seems to be something I'm digging up, which is like the more I guess what I want to talk about with Matthew is the idea that health is something that is has an elusive quality. And in our program, we get at each of these subjects really deeply. But what I'm noticing is that sometimes we can have such a rigid discipline around these subjects so that we add them into our lives on top of a 70-hour work week or a 50-hour work week or children and caring for animals and cars and homes and stuff that it ends up seeming like it's just another responsibility. So I started to ask Matthew questions. And so we wanted to talk about what it means to be healthy and how that relates to happiness. And so I'm going to have him introduce himself, and then we're going to go through each of the pillars from a different kind of lens. I think he does a lot to help me unpack some of these ideas, and then we'll go from there. And in the process, we're going to talk about our experiment in radical well-being that started like 15 years ago with all of these areas and all of these pillars. So Matthew, would you mind introducing yourself and telling us a little bit about who you are and what it's like to be a Foot Nerd family member, and then also why you think that the Happiness podcast might be valuable.
Okay, hello, my name is Matthew. I am originally from California and now I live in Alabama. I teach at a small liberal arts college in Mobile, Alabama. And my background is, as far as work goes, it's focusing on philosophy, literature, culture, mainly Western European thought. So I have a PhD in literature and that's what I get to teach. So I enjoy doing that. I enjoy being able to talk about those things. I enjoy language and I enjoy the relationship of ideas to, the way in which we put them into practice, the types of jobs we have, the ways we decide on how to live our lives, whether we're voting, trying to create a political structure or relationship to where we live. Or at the same time trying to create a balance between the mind and the body, as we oftentimes say. And those are things that I'm fortunate enough to be able to kind of study and teach, but then also use those ideas to improve my own life and create more balance, create a fuller, happier, more fulfilling daily experience. embodied play, joy type of just doing, and not always focused on having and being able to plan everything out in advance. So that's mainly what I focus on in general in regards to my work, in regards to my personal life. And being a foot nerd allows me to kind of hear about these ideas, and kind of occasionally I did participate in one Zoom call, but I get to overhear a lot of them, and I know a lot about the foot nerd community, and I like the idea of trying to challenge some of the structures that are in place in regards to how we think about education, we think about creating ways of finding and appropriating and using the information that we feel is important to us. So I think that I've been able to do that in a lot of ways through the kind of university system. At the same time, I'm ambivalent in a lot of regards about some of the real structural challenges and problems that exist there. But that's where I do my work currently, and that's where I kind of steal most of my ideas, because I feel like it's really an opportunity to see where there's an enormous amount of richness, both in a kind of capitalist system. Our American universities are extremely well funded, so I've always thought of being a little bit someone who can be there and kind of get as much information as I can and bring it into my own life, and then bring it into the lives of the larger community. So it kind of complicates some of the problems that exist in regards to the university being a type of ivory tower institution, which it is in many ways, I feel. But I feel there's a lot of ways in which we can smuggle out some of those ideas and put them to pretty radical or progressive or interesting or fun, playful ends.
Mm-hmm. So Matthew and I met maybe over 20 years ago now, longer.
Mm-hmm.
And when we were very good friends. Matthew spent some time in the Peace Corps when he got back, and we began dating. And then subsequently we started a life together. I remembered that like there were certain things that he did, like he would let the water just trickle a tiny little bit, or would really take care in recycling even like paper towels and stuff that were like super really thick paper towels. And I couldn't really understand. So we started talking a little bit about his experience in the Peace Corps and what it was like being there, and how I'm telling you this, foot nerd community, because this was like, I think, a big awakening for me in the idea of what it means to be, my personal idea of what it means to be healthy. Was what I was watching him take such care in his life, and I didn't understand like why he wasn't turning on the water faucet full throttle, or why he wouldn't just throw those paper towels away, even though they just had water on them or whatever. I was like, well, just go to the store and get more. But when he started to explain to me what it was like there, and like how there were no garbage trucks that would come through, so if you made garbage, you had to be responsible for what you were making, and that blew my mind. I was like, I never thought about not having a garbage man in my life. So I guess where I want to go from here is just talking about, like, from the beginning, we're in the, I'm in the Foot Nerd program, and I'm the director of the Foot Nerd program, and Matthew is a foot nerd by proxy because he lives it every single day. But this journey for us started a long, long time ago. And so I started paying closer attention to like what the question popped into my mind: what would it be like to not have somebody pick up my garbage? And I think my whole life changed at that moment. And then it's just been a progressive path down a progressive journey down this path. And so I was hoping that what we could do in this particular episode is just talk about the overviews of, and Matthew, wherever you want to go with this, like starting with sleep, and then with food, or starting with sleep, movement, and then we'll just kind of go through the 5 pillars, and whatever you feel like talking about with regards to like your history and your ideas on what health is in that regard, as it relates to like, and also happiness, like how it relates to happiness and well-being. So let's start with sleep. Well,
I think I think sleep is obviously a foundation for health. I think it's something that I've always prioritized. I'm not somebody who likes to be super active. I obviously, in order to get through life and to, get a PhD and to find a job in the world today and do stuff that you have to be very goal oriented at the same time, I have a pretty good kind of lazy peasant mentality or something like that. And I mean that in a positive sense, in the way that it's oftentimes perceived by the overly industrious kind of Western mindset, the idea that somebody who's not constantly working and improving oneself and doing things almost in an ostentatious way, a type of performative excess of sorts. That's never really interested me. I've always valued the things that can't easily be evaluated with metrics, like how is your life getting better because you sleep more, those types of things. I think it's a type of lived experience, a type of qualitative pleasure. I think there's real pleasure in doing those things. And so I tend to value sleep, and I've always kind of selected jobs and job paths and things like that. I was an athlete when I was younger, and I've always used that as being a kind of guide to, being well rested so I can play and do stuff, and at the same time perform and be competitive and kind of set goals for myself in the athletic sense. And that, kind of bleeds over into the rest of my life. So sleep is the foundation for health in a larger sense. And I think health, in just to touch upon that, is something that should be conceived as capaciously as possible, as having a lot of capacity, as having something that is not nearly full enough in the sense. I'm more interested in thickness and fullness and types of metaphors about ways in which we talk about and try and add a measure of analysis to things that are very difficult to do, which are largely qualitative art forms in a certain way. I think there's a lot to be said for science and technology. At the same time, I think some of the largely human questions, the eternal questions, are things that are more about circular rhythms of life, the seasons changing, the change in a person's life from youth to middle age, adolescence to old age, and having a type of hopefully social system in place that can help to deal and create a full circular type of uh, just kind of experience of life, something like a flower opening. I'm really suspicious of metaphors of progress, of linearity, about moving in a singular path, kind of going forward into unknown territories, and those things. I think they are shot through with all kinds of problems in regards to our relationship to self and other, and especially, politically, things like colonialism and just the terrible influence of science historically, in the 20th century. I tend to be somebody who looks at the kind of ways in which science has been conceived and the kind of ways of talking about it, the discourses, especially in France. That's my area of focus. And so I've always been interested in mystical thinkers and thinkers who really kind of cut science down to size a little bit by saying science can do a lot. Science can actually help us to really make enormous and important and necessary improvements in our life. And that's the whole promise of the Enlightenment within Western thought. But at the same time, enlightenment can come full circle and actually be very destructive. If you look at some of the German thinkers, there's the dialectic of enlightenment, which talks about this same thing about, I guess we could say, well-meaning idea, which is the Enlightenment, eventually becomes something that leads to, like the atomic bomb and, concentration camps and the really efficient way of exterminating, killing people through scientific, technological means. So that's something we have to be on guard against. And I don't know that we can fully be on guard against that unless we give ourselves over to the other half of our existence, which is more what you might call, some thinkers that I study, some, type of writers, some artists, whatever you want to call them, which tend to be categorized as mystical or intuitive thinkers, which are kind of looking for ways in which you avail yourself to the cycles of life, in which you allow the flows of affect, which is kind of a word for emotion, but something that is in a lot of ways electrical, or something that goes between people and that helps us to get outside of ourselves. I think if we continue with the 5 pillars, one of the real dangers of Western thought, in my experience and in my opinion, is the fact that we tend to be highly focused on interiority and thinking about my problems and my things and my security. And I certainly am victim to a lot of that type of stuff. But like you said, in regards to the Peace Corps, I've always been somebody who wanted to get as much experience as possible. If you look at the idea, the model of the citizen scientist, somebody who goes out and tries to collect data and tries to, in some ways, um, shock the system, do a little bit of violence to the system, as you would say in French, kind of just as you with exercising, pushing your limits, trying to find ways in which you experience things and you allow the body to be in some ways a gauge for how that is interpreted through fatigue, through joy, through bliss, through endorphins, through all the things you can kind of approach through a number of ways, so that it's not kind of falling into this relatively static idea of not doing much with the body and then thinking of the mind as almost being something that's sloshing around in a jar and that is disconnected from the world and is kind of constantly in this very fraught relationship to other, in which we're always thinking about the world is there to cancel out my uniqueness and to destroy me and send me to eternal darkness or to heaven or whatever it is we do. I think those metaphors and those ideas, and I don't mean to critique them in any way, they're certainly valuable, but I think they need to be fleshed out and made really full and thick. And to use anthropological language, there's a certain thickness of life that I think is oftentimes missing in regards to ideational types of forms, ideas, things that aren't located in a specific moment in time. So if an idea is important, it should be connected to a number of ways in which it's been put into practice, and it's been either shown to be very useful or maybe dubious or maybe not quite appropriate for that moment or that time. And so those are the ways in which I think that health can be thought of more through a type of thickness or a type of fullness or a type of complexity or a type of multidimensional quality that in a lot of ways helps to frustrate or decenter or kind of destabilize what I think is the real danger in Western thought, which is to think we're always going into some new linear path, and progress is I think progress is way, way overstated. I think that we can get way ahead of ourselves in regards to progress. Yes, technology does improve the possibilities for our lives, but at the same time, it brings new challenges that if they're not met with a fully functioning human embodied person and community, right? It's not the person, it's the person in relationship to community, then you are going to have just as many problems and even more probably overwhelming types of problems that you're not going to be able to deal with. And your technological tools are going to be largely inefficient and really just, you've gained you've really lost everything by gaining this type of technological superiority.
I have a question for you actually about along these lines. So, like in the Footnote program, or if you're at all interested in the science of health at all. So there's a ton of books on, let's just stick with sleep right now. The science of sleeping, right? So the simplistic idea is that we probably need more sleep, or we delve into the science of sleep, and every possible data set that you could uncover is probably recorded and written about, and it's like all the rage to talk about and to unpack the science of sleep. So if you're talking about the thickness or the fullness of what it means to approach sleep in a different way, like how would you address that?
Well, I think sleep kind of functions as, in a lot of ways, like if you look at the circular quality, which I think is another way of kind of helping us to not get stuck in linear thinking. I'm not saying that we shouldn't set goals for ourselves and try and travel a certain, create metaphors of travel and journey. I think that's one of the foundations for literature, And some people joke that there's only two stories, a new person comes to town, or, someone goes on a journey. Right. And both of those, you introduce newness into what is otherwise, kind of a homeostatic situation. So in regards to sleep, I think that's what it does, is that it introduces a necessary counterbalance to our tendency to always be thinking about working and always be thinking about thinking and always be thinking about doing and always be doing about, these types of things in which we get so fast, we get moving, and there's really no way of balancing that out without a really robust practice of sleep. And I think a robust practice of sleep, like the Footnote program says, is limiting screen time. And not only that, but there's so many people out there. I'm interested in sleep, especially in regards to performance, athletes. I'm fascinated about athletes in which you have this the game theory type of model, which was introduced in a podcast I really liked. Really thinking about the ways in which we're playing a game in life. And when you play a game, you need time to rest and relax. Otherwise, you're not going to win. You're not going to perform at all. You're not going to enjoy your performance, and you're certainly not going to be successful and do the types of things that you like. So without that really enormous counterbalance of sleep in our life, we don't have much of a hope of kind of being fully in the game and kind of thinking about the ways in which we create incentives in our life. And so sleep is allowing us to be fully rested. So when I wake up in the morning, I like to be super full of energy. I'm grown increasingly intolerant of being tired at any point throughout the day. And at the same time in the evening, I find myself moving across the country and starting a new job, as I did 3 years ago, coming from California, moving to Alabama, which is a small state in the south of the US. Very different environment, very different university, very different town, very different everything. So took a lot of practice. And to speak personally, that was a moment in which I tended to work too much and think too much. And so it was hard to set that kind of line in the evening in which, okay, I'm going to turn it all off, because I think my mind can kind of get away with duping myself into thinking, okay, I'll stop here. But really it has to be a kind of joyful lingering or tarrying, or kind of slowly going into sleep, where you slowly start to wind down and you shake the day off and you allow yourself to move into the soft animal of the body. And you allow yourself to become someone who not only begrudgingly accepts sleep, as I have many friends who do. And I kind of say, well, how does that work for you? What is it that you're so interested in doing all the time? I mean, days are long. I come from a tradition of thought, if you look at Charles Baudelaire or somebody like this, the great evil in life is ennui. It's like this metaphysical boredom. How do we spend our days, when in fact many of us privileged Westerners, I speak personally, but others who would identify with that, how do we find ways of getting through the day when we're not forced to labor a whole heck of a lot in the fields, like many people are today, like many people are in many different places, both here in the US, everywhere, and around the world. And we're involved in these types of relationships through the supply chains that we kind of utilize, through the way in which the world is constructed nowadays. You can't turn on the water faucet or the lights without being really morally implicated in a very complex system of relations. So in some ways, slowing down and recognizing that I may not be able to change the world in the ways that I think would be good, and maybe I don't even know, probably, a lot of times my ideas aren't very useful for changing the world, but at the same time I can slow down and I can kind of sink back into what I would call largely the human condition, which is one that is shared across a multiplicity of living arrangements, which is the fact that you sleep, which is the fact that you get up, which is the fact that you allow yourself at the end of the day to really have gratitude, and in the morning to get up and slowly kind of enter the day as much as possible. I'm not saying everybody is involved around the world, but I have lived in places, where it's very different. And we're not in a place where you wake up and jump on the computer or jump up and start doing stuff. When you live in, sub-Saharan Africa, where I was at, it's very, very hot, and so for the most, you're pacing yourself because you don't have the technological accoutrements to help to render your life and make it so fluid and so really possible to spend all this time constantly thinking and doing and achieving. You're not doing a lot of that. You're subsisting, in a very, and there's plenty of stuff I could say about this, and I hope to, about some of the books and some of the ideas which I think are really useful for others, which have marked my life and I think are awesome. And like I said before, that's what I like the idea of a type of public intellectual, to use Gramsci's term. Somebody who I'm a first generation college student, so I kind of come from two different worlds, trying to explain some of the complexity and why I live my life the way I do, and why the heck I should get a PhD. I've never been somebody who's done things because I think, well, I'm going to get this because I want to get that. I didn't get a PhD to get a job, but I just kind of followed one step after the other, and I would have never thought I'd end up working as a college professor. But it's kind of following those things, and that is, I think, the recipe for life. And I think it's the recipe for a daily form of fulfilling existence, is that you create those things in which you fully accept that and relish it and enjoy it and sink into the delicious quality of sleep. And also that moment before, when you're allowing yourself to slow down and create incentives for being a human again, as opposed to a mind in a jar, which is a
Mhm.
privileged Western type of form of existence, as I would say, right?
Mhm.
As somebody who knows that as an intellectual,
Wait, what do you mean by mind in a jar?
as I mentioned earlier, somebody who tends to not have to labor, who doesn't have to either, you know,
Labor physically?
labor physically, be exploited, be forced to do jobs that they don't want to do.
Mhm.
I'm saying everybody has this. I mean, I don't always love my job or love the way that I do it, but I have an enormous privilege and the potential to kind of change the daily structure of my life and change what I do in regards to what I teach and how I kind of introduce new ideas. So I have that at the same time, but I can also fall into what I feel in the university system is this, what's oftentimes used as this justification for always being in the ivory tower position of thinking and kind of writing and being this scholar removed from society in the ivory tower. It's, I think, a very dangerous type of path to go down. And oftentimes you talk about it's like an Aristotelian life of the mind, which I think is way overstated because um, at the same time, you have to balance out the life of the mind with the life of the body. And if you do that, I think then you earn your sleep. I think if one of the
Mhm.
books said that along those lines, I mean, sleep is something that you earn. I mean, it's something if you, I know a lot of people personally who aren't intellectuals. I know a lot of people who have a problem doing the simple human embodied things like waking up in the morning without significant chemical intervention. I'm not against coffee. I'm not against these types of things. But at the same time, as the Footnote program would say, be careful with those things. Be careful with the way you think about addictions.
Mhm.
Same thing about going to bed at night. How can you shut off the mind? How can you slow the body down? How can you get into that space of necessary sleep
Mhm.
without, having to use a lot of interventions, which
Mhm.
are not going to be good in the long run,
And if you're just listening to something like this for the first time, when we talk about earning sleep and physicality, it's becoming a person, a human, like Matthew was talking about, is we move our bodies more than we're actually static and sedentary. So one of the major things that we do is we try to calculate how much we actually sit, and we usually fool ourselves recognizing only certain aspects of sitting and not calculating the time that we're in a car or sitting at the dinner table or in a restaurant or something. So becoming somebody who earns your sleep, it means that you are physically and mentally tired when you go to bed, and sleep comes more easily. We tend to not have to need Ambien or whatever, or cannabis or whatever it is that you use to put yourself to sleep and put your mind to sleep when your body is sufficiently exercised through, and not at the gym necessarily, but just by moving on a daily basis more than your sedentary, is is what we're talking about. So that seems like a good segue into moving. You want to give us a little bit of background about maybe your background? Oh, what I would love to talk to you about is like a little bit of your history with what it meant to be a mover when you were younger and what it means to be a mover now, and towards the middle of your life.
Yeah, I mean, I've always enjoyed sports and I've always played sports from when I was a young age. That was one of the things I was thankful to be able to do, to kind of be, as you say, in the US, a student athlete, because I certainly would have been a student who would have completed college and certainly wouldn't have got on to university without having those incentives to be in the school experience. I grew up in the country. I grew up with my parents are farmers, so it was kind of a real move to go to school. It was 15 minutes in the car, but it was going outside of the environment once you grow up, which is largely quiet and a lot of TV and certainly no internet back then. And um, doing that and kind of being in town and playing sports and all that type of stuff gave me, and at school as well. I always thought of school as not simply a place where you do homework. In fact, I always thought that it was ridiculous that we had to do homework as much time as we spent in school. I always kind of laugh now because as a young child, it occurred to me like, well, why do we have to do work at home when we spend, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 hours, whatever it was we spent in school, because you'd have to take the bus and you have to get up in the morning. You have to make a pretty significant trip in there, and then you have to be away. And I appreciate that. I like that because I like being with my friends and I like playing on recess. And I liked, I wasn't for the most part a negative experience at all. And I didn't find school to be super difficult. It wasn't something where I defined myself as being, smart, whatever. I was lucky to have parents who, provided a space in which I could, get enough sleep and enough nutrition and those types of things. And I know that's not the case for everybody. And so school came easy to me, but because of those things, it was something that I was able to think of school as not simply, oh God, I got to pass this homework class. So many kids nowadays, they're, if they don't get into the right preschool, then their parents' master plan is sending them to Princeton or what some other Ivy League school is foiled. And they have to have 18 extracurricular activities, none of which they're particularly thrilled about. I never had any of that type of pressure. And so I'm very thankful for it. And so I kind of developed this organic form of thought where going to school is about moving through time and space, because you had to get up in the morning and wait. And I grew up in California, but it's cold in the Central Valley. So you're waiting out for the bus at, 7 in the morning, and there's ice on the puddles and stuff in the winter. And, I would go in there and to town, and then you'd have practice after school as I got older, and I was just playing sports. And that's why another way of thinking about it's a complex, fully nuanced, just a very different, the words I would use now from anthropological angles, there's a thickness to it. I can think about it now, and it's many, many years ago, and I'm super far away from it, but I can call it up right now because I lived it rather fully, I would say. And those memories are the memories that endure. And that is something that has always been part and parcel of how I approach school, because people would think now, well, you're a professor, whatever this, you get a PhD, all that type of stuff. But it was really just a daily practice of attending to how I constructed my life. And as I went through my life, I excelled at sports, and I played baseball in college, and, I played baseball, basketball in high school. And so I enjoyed that a lot. At the same time, some of the books like Katie Bowman's book on overtraining, or the ways in which movement oftentimes is subsumed in a kind of category, a very narrow category of practice or like training or something like that, whether we go to the gym or whether we go to practice and do some of that type of stuff. I certainly experienced that as I got further along and found it to be a little bit more difficult to live a life that's fully rewarding, and I thought allowed me the necessary downtime to sleep well, but also to experience my social life and allow myself to continue to grow as an individual. To many parts. That's why I guard my time. That's why I sleep a lot, because I think I have a lot of stuff to do each day, but at the same time, it's fairly modest about the movement, because I don't know if our listeners know, but we don't have a car, so that's one of the things we decided to get rid of when we moved to France over a decade ago. We got rid of the car just because
13 years ago, to be specific.
Yeah. And then we over there, there was a lot of things we liked. The older cities, centers, you can kind of get around more easily. The focus on public transportation, something that hasn't always been the case here in the US, but we've committed to that because it's a way of moving through the world, I think, in a more deliberate sense, as opposed to getting into what I fall victim to, is like going to the gym and doing a bunch of stuff because it feels good, to counterbalance all the thinking and the emails and the paperwork. It's not even like I'm sitting there like, coming up with big ideas or solving the world's problems. I'm mainly just sending emails and filling out, freaking paperwork. Most of my job, it's like, and I don't say that in any cynical way. I think that's just the modern bureaucratic nature of life in a large sense. And so to fight against that and kind of accept that because it yields significant benefits, at least currently I accept it. I think those are some of the ways I think that movement is a multifaceted thing. It's not just going to the gym, it's certainly playing sports. I tend to be more into tennis now, and I've gotten back into doing more weight training and more stuff, just in a sense where I kind of got burnt out on that when I was younger. And the sports that I played, basketball and baseball, I don't tend to play them as much anymore. So it's kind of a transition of sorts. And I've been discovering other things. I've rowed in the past. In college, I rowed some as well, and as a master's student. And so I've done a lot of things that have been a lot of fun and have allowed me to kind of keep unfolding as an individual and trying new things. And so there's a lot of play involved with that. I really like coordination games. I'm not big into endurance or running unless it's about having fun and chasing after a ball or trying to, I don't know, achieve something, but I'm not super big into that type of stuff. I like it to have a game theory where you create incentives that are organic and it's not about disciplining yourself into doing things. And at the same time, the way I incentivize, and I think we incentivize ourselves without the car, is like, well, we walk to get the groceries, we walk to do things, we walk just in general because it allows us to stay fit. And that also allows me to clear my mind and actually to be in the world. If you look at the book, The New Old Way, which is part of the Foot Nerd program, it's about the relationship to habitat. And that's super big within the mystical tradition, you know, the ways in which we largely look beyond the world. We just, in a lot of sense, cancel out everything that isn't immediately useful to us. I think that's the analytical mind. I think that's the real danger, as I said. If you look at Henri Bergson's thought, a big type of scientist in, you know, turn of the century France, uh, and he's basically saying that we need to complement that analytical quality and not create an enemy out of it by thinking, oh, I'm always just, you need that in order to stay alive. You need that to be in the world. You need to that. And now, not so much as a hunter-gatherer sense, but if you go in the world, and I think that's one of the things, if you ride public transportation, if you go and you walk through a city, you have to be more awake to things. Even if you drive your car, you know, but in large ways we can be on autopilot in certain ways. But I like being in a fully embodied sense where I'm understanding those things and I'm kind of treating the world as something that deserves respect and that I have to honor. But in the same ways I sometimes think about when we lived in Santa Cruz in the West Coast or like in Long Beach in the South, I had a lot of surfer friends. Not a big surfer myself, but if you go out onto a wave and you feel the immense, you know, power of the ocean and there's a reverence for it. And I like talking to surfer friends who talk about that. And I think that's a great metaphor as well for thinking about life, is you need to respect life and be in a position also where life can crush you and kind of really do damage to you. You need to do violence to yourself, but at the same time, in a very organic, slowly unfolding way. And so,
yeah, give an example of that, because people might not understand what you mean when you say like do violence to yourself.
well, that's why I use like the surfing metaphor, because it's like if you like to surf, if you like the ocean, it's a very great experience. You know, it's be out there and to do stuff. And you know, if you're, I mean, it's a very invigorating experience if you're in the ocean in California where it's cold and you wear a wetsuit. Oftentimes, you know, it's different. It's just a very, you know, powerful thing. And at the same time, if you go out, not even on a super big wave, but you can't mess around because you could get hurt. And especially when you start to go to the places where the waves are really breaking. And that's why I mentioned some of my better surfing friends, you know, they'll talk about that. And, you know, they'll talk about how they negotiate that and having just a small taste of that. And if you go out on the ocean at all, you feel that. And I think that gives us a more useful way of relating to the massive cosmic energies, whatever we call the world, right? But the world usually is like, well, I'm walking down a sidewalk and paved and talking, and all these things that like Katie Bowman would talk about, the way in which habitat, or Frank Forenchich, I guess, would say habitat, it tends to be paved over. We lose our relationship to its full complexity. And I think without getting into overly analytical forms, it's just like if you've ever been on a wave or something like that, you have to honor that. And why would you do that? You don't do that because it's like, well, I want to go out and scare myself. Maybe you do to a certain, because it's fun. It's fun to be in the ocean. It's fun to ride a wave. It's fun to do that type of stuff. And it's a good example of how I think you incentivize your life to that game theory model. And in so doing, you create a more, I think, you know, I don't like to use the word honest, but, you know, like more, I think, useful way of being in relationship to the world, so you get the necessary feedback that you need, as opposed to getting a lot of feedback that might not be as useful for your ultimate happiness or health.
Yeah, so like if you were to, well, so personally, I've had like a lot of joint pain and some dealing with some knee injury. And so just taking up tennis recently. Tell me if this is another example of like kind of like doing violence, like testing yourself almost beyond like what you think might be safe. So like I played tennis for 2 hours yesterday with I'm working on an old knee injury that I'm trying to strengthen, and I was afraid to play because the knee isn't like perfect. So I played for 2 hours and I came home and I got some good information, some good data and some good feedback. And my first instinct was like, I shouldn't have done that much. But I think like you're talking about like maybe like doing that kind of like violence to yourself, like kind of testing yourself in a way that might feel a little bit dangerous, but you get good feedback and then you can make adjustments. Like Nick talks about this a lot, about injuries. Like you can't go, I have tried to go my whole life or the last 15 years without injuring myself. And I have missed out on the joy of playing, like Matthew's talking about. And so more recently, I'm actually working through some of the pain in different ways and testing myself in even bigger ways. So would you say like that's an idea, that's like another idea of like doing like violence to yourself, where like you almost put a little more pressure on yourself than you would normally be comfortable with?
Yeah, and I'm really oftentimes borrowing ideas and, thought structures. One of the things being mainly somebody, a user, and if you want to say a scholar of Italian and French, is that I think when you learn other languages, you really enter into a deep relationship to how these thought patterns are mapped onto the world. So we say things, based on what we call them. And sometimes we have more vocabulary available for certain languages because they live in a different relationship to their habitat. And that's one of the things that so oftentimes I'm using the French expression to do violence to yourself, which in English doesn't translate super well. But I think because of the awkwardness of it, I'm big into translation, something I like to do. I like to translate. In fact, I do translate. I have the privilege of working with really compelling philosophers in the contemporary moment, thinking about the nature of democracy and about public happiness. And I hope to talk about that in future episodes, because I think when you take other ideas, when you really force yourself to go beyond your linguistic parameters. So it's not just about jumping in the ocean or doing stuff. I mean, you have to approach these things in a way where violence tends to think, well, good Lord, you're doing too much. Maybe, but the French expression is more about forcing yourself, like, and the violence that, that is in the French expression allows you to think about that it is something that it's embodied, it's an embodied experience. It's not just like, well, I'm uncomfortable at this. It is something that is fairly difficult that you probably have to, move your body to do and really compel yourself to do these types of metaphors, the way that we structure our language in order to, I think, give us useful feedback for how we're kind of pushing the limits. Because yeah, as Nick had said about like the nature of injuries as being a very good feedback. I had an injury playing tennis recently and it really changed my perspective. It was frustrating and it was difficult to think about and it's difficult to experience on a daily level, on a very slow daily recuperative level. But I think that is also something that is really useful, because if you are not in some ways pushing your limits, and you can't give advice. I can't tell you, well, go hurt yourself or go do this or go push yourself to the limit. I mean, you have to, in a lot of ways, be involved in a mimetic relationship. I'm big about mimesis as well. Not so much always saying, well, the nature of this, in order to be happy or to be this, is to understand this and that. I don't think that's very useful. I don't think that's the way the world works. I think that's the way that the Western tradition of thought works. And I think its claims are way overstated. Okay. So I think largely you don't have to be an intellectual, and certainly it can hinder you. There are positive ways of using ideas. There are also negative ways, and there's a certain freshness and vitality to life. I'm really big into looking at societies that don't have, written or writing as a technology, oral societies in that sense. And I just love the way that they approach the world in such a very different type of relationship. So especially in France, especially as the French language is being basically forced upon a lot of peasants and things like that. That's something I like to read about and research, and kind of also at the same time think about my own life. And I think that's where I'm always been interested in people who don't have a literary structure or overly cumbersome intellectual structure, which I think we do, no matter if you're in the university or whatever. You have nothing but ideas on the internet. That's what the internet is. It's ideas and people emoting about ideas and things like that. And I don't mean to trash it and stuff like that, but it's something that really drowns us and it's super hard to get away from. So I think the way that I try and counterbalance that is to think about ways of, creating other relationships to experience, so that you're a fully functioning somebody who's able to test yourself and say, well, maybe I want to learn this new language, or maybe I want to learn this new sport. Well, my God, where do I find the time? And where do I find the sleep, the amount of time to sleep, and the amount of time to adjust to the other commitments I've made in my life, paying my mortgage or raising my kids or thinking about those things? Do you allow enough space in your life for you to do violence to the categories of who it is you want to be as a fully functioning human? And I think it's easy to get hemmed in and to think, well, I would love to do that, and I want to do that, and it's on my bucket list. I think that bucket list thing is like, whatever. It's like, do it now. Like, and I think there's a certain immediacy, maybe because of all the coronavirus restrictions and stuff, where people seem to be in some ways emerging from some of the things, at least here in the US. I don't know. I mean, I know that it's a complex situation other places around the world, but I think just in the spaces here, it seems like, and from what I read, in some ways, people are starting to say like, okay, the bucket list needs to be something I do now. It needs to be, I need to create a horizon of possibility for myself. And when you do that, then you have a chance for happiness and health to be experiences that you regularly partake in. That's my claim.
Yeah.
My suggestion. Right? It's not a thesis, like a suggestion and based on somewhat of my experience.
Yeah. Well, I think I kind of want to unpack the public happiness because it has a lot to do with movement, and like what in the book New Old Way, Matthew and I have been really hooked on the theme of vigility, which I never really understood. I never actually even really heard that word before I started reading this book about the idea that before the world was sort of paved over, or the industrial world came about, we had a lot of room to walk, to move through the world for long, long stretches. And so when I read the chapter on vigility, I became very aware of my surroundings and how closed in I felt physically. So if I had anger to express, there was no place to really like scream or like throw a ball or like, or run for miles like Forrest Gump or whatever. So without running into a freeway or traffic jam or whatever. So if could go right into public happiness and what it means to be able to move freely in the world. And it's a good time for it, even though we'll do the other 5 pillars in subsequent episodes. Maybe we could just unpack a little bit because this is a good time. We just recently came from Mobile, Alabama to Tampa, Florida for the summer. And we visited here about a month and a half ago. When we did so, we got on the Riverwalk and we just started walking, and there was like nothing in our way. We could just walk for like, I don't know, 4 miles. We kind of forgot what we were doing or where we were going or any time frame. We just went. And now I know that like people who live in forests and go hiking and stuff, that's one thing, but to walk out your door of where you live and just go without any preparation is something different. So being in the world with people on boats, walking around in the park, there's tons of spaces where there's like playgrounds everywhere and children playing and people moving together and weddings out in the open. And there was an overwhelming feeling of like, oh, this is an aspect of human vigility that I think in a modern sense, that I think Frank Gorancic is talking about in a new old way, right? Because if you think about it in like the paleo or whatever, or back when hunter gatherers, well, we don't live in that environment. We live in cities and we live in populated areas. So maybe we can just talk about agility and public happiness, and we'll carry on in other episodes.
Yeah, these are big questions. So like we talked about not having a car, I think that's one of the reasons why you're forced to move about the world in a number of ways. The car just takes away, it becomes a totalizing type of logic and technology in my life in that sense, is that you start to make decisions based on what you can do in a car. And then next thing you know, living in places like LA or things like that, where you commute, you spend all your time driving around, or other places as well. But like, it's a common type of practice, and it's one that I have never really been interested in. And so it's good that I haven't done that. But at the same time, I've certainly used a car plenty of my life, and kind of moving away from that and looking at the ways, first of all, in which you're forced to be creative and also interested in problem solving about moving about spaces, especially city spaces. I like the city. I like to think about the city and the relationship to the countryside, which is a very rich, complex, difficult relationship in a lot of ways in regards to where riches are, where capital accumulates, where people in general are able to secure a certain privilege and comfort, and then other ways in which it's not always as easy as that. Oftentimes, there's better ways of living outside of a city, and obviously, I think it's a nice way of moving about as much as possible. Just like I mentioned, going to other places and being from the countryside, growing up and living in cities a lot in my life, and different types of cities. So I like to move around in space, and I think not having a car compels you to do that. And the other thing that it does is it forces you to be in public in relationship to others. And I think that, as I've said, is I think one of the crucial elements about modern happiness. One of the philosophers that I work with, and her book is going to be available for the first time in English at the end of August. And I translated it, and it basically makes the claim. I think we can maybe talk about it in future episodes because there's a lot to unpack there, but it makes the claim that you cannot really experience happiness unless it is a collective phenomenon. It's something, happiness is experienced in public with others, or it's not happiness. And so it might be a little bit polemical, it might be a little bit heavy handed, but I think there's a lot to it. The fact that the modern, as I've said before, the modern focus on interiority, my psychology, my problems, myself, I am, I want, I am not, that type of just linguistic way in which we approach the world and create a hostile relationship to it. Oftentimes, the world is there to frustrate me, or whether it's a traffic jam, or somebody not making my coffee fast enough at Starbucks, or whatever it is. That type of way of thinking about the world is a very dangerous one, and a way of kind of maybe complicating that relationship is to kind of be in the world in a different way, kind of move through it in a way that allows you to get outside of yourself. And I think that's as simple as going to a park and maybe seeing others around you. And that's what we've experienced. We've really enjoyed about Tampa. That's why we decided to be here over the summer. Um, like I
Well,
said,
I would just wanted to say is that like the thing that is coming up right now is that like how it can be more simple than we make it out to be. So like we started in the beginning about like what it means to dig into the 5 pillars of health and like really study and then like really create habits around being healthier with sleep and movement, et cetera, et cetera. But like when you talk about public happiness in this way, all you have to do to experience. So you were talking about like experiencing the world and interiority, like how we have this customized personal world. Like everybody has their own personal playlist, and we've experienced this. Everybody going by on a bike has their own playlist going on their bike, on their rollerblades. There's no common like radio station that everybody has to listen to the same music at once, or watch the same television show. So that, but in order to change that, it doesn't need to necessarily, a step in the right direction rather is not necessarily to like study anything or go to therapy, or I'm not saying that's not helpful, but to maybe just step outside for a day. Like when we were younger, we used to do this thing called urban hiking where we would just put our backpacks on, have a little cash in our backpack, and then just take the city and take the day and see where it took us. And then just like being out in the world and seeing people and interacting spontaneously with other people, it changes you even just after one day of just being in the world, not necessarily with anything to do or any place to go or any event to be at, just the actual exercise of going into the public world. What do you say
yeah,
about that?
absolutely. Yeah, I think that's the idea. And the challenge is that the claim of this philosopher Adriana Cavarero is that it's not so easy to find a public, right? That's the idea. In today's world, we tend to be atomized individuals, like little atoms who are separated from each other, removed from a type of common space. We tend to be in our cars, we tend to be in our cubicles, we tend to be in our houses, in the suburbs, or in our apartments, or whatever it is. We don't have maybe a robust practice of being in commons, which is a big aspect of modern social thought, thinking about ways of simply creating ways of being together in which, in theory, everyone is invited. Now that's in theory, right? Certainly, usually they tend to be commodified, or they tend to be policed. so that you have to have a certain appearance, or you have to have a certain income, or you have to have a certain performative capacity. That means that you look like you are allowed to be there, right? And these are big questions nowadays, like how we think about, the city and whether it's safe, and how we think about police's forces, and how we think about our own idea of being in the city. But I think city planners more and more are thinking about the need for people to get outside of our tendency to be indoors all the time. And I think if you look at just, I think maybe Frank Fornchich talks about or something, we spend 94% or 90 something percent of our time indoors. It's just so hard to be outside unless you are somebody who has a job out there, and as being somebody who, as I said, sends a lot of emails and does a lot of paperwork and stuff like that, I'm always looking for opportunities to be outside in order to balance out this other type of thing. First of all, because it makes me happy, but also because it allows me to get away and to create some possibility of relating to others. Because I think, in general, one of the larger tendencies of modern society is the inability to create connections between generations. That's something that I feel I've noticed in regards to my family and my life. Well, you get a job and you move away, you live far away from your parents or from your grandparents or from the people who in general would be considered your elders, who will help you deal with some of the things in life, hopefully, right? It's not always easy to occupy that position of being an elder, but in general, a lot of time is spent just being around people that are not like you. And that's where I mentioned the word mimesis, which is just to mimic. It's really just to look at and learn based on the way that somebody is moving, holding themselves. They're communicating a whole hell of a lot. And they're doing it without language. And they're doing it oftentimes across different cultures, although, of course, we have to be careful about interpreting and things always in the same way. But in general, there are ways of learning which don't have to be filtered so much through the prism of language, which tends to crush our intuitive appreciation of the world, right? It tends to filter it through a whole ways. Did I experience that right? Should I do this? Should I move my foot that way? Should I eat 4 grapes as drinking coffee bad for you? Is alcohol that? There's a lot of questions that, frankly, it depends. What do you want out of life? Where do you live? How are you living? That type of stuff. Whereas looking at somebody doing things, whether you're learning to hit a tennis forehand properly, or you're learning to deal with the sadness of losing somebody, in your life, somebody close to you, or a pet, or whatever it is, you see people rise to the occasion and do things that you might not have expected from them based on your linguistic relationship to them. And so that's what I feel like a way of learning is by being in commons, being around other people. But that is very difficult to do because, frankly, most of our lives now tend to be largely removed from other people. And I think nowadays there's more of an emphasis in many cities to say, like, we need public parks, we need green spaces, we need these types of things. We need ways in which everybody's invited to be there. And it's not just having a certain income that allows you to go there. It's a way of being able to kind of learn from others and be around others and experience happiness with a public, in what Hannah Arendt, who is the philosopher that Adriana Cavalera works on and who I really like as well, talks about as a public space of appearance, a way in which you can appear to others, almost as if you're staging the drama of human life or the comedy of human life, whatever it is. I don't mean to,
for example,
generic of categories, but you're kind of performing there.
Yeah, I was just going to say that when we're on the river walk and all those boats go by that are like thatched hut boats and kettle boats, and people are on there celebrating. And we were just talking about an example of this is that if you were walking down that river walk, and people are listening to music and dancing and interacting with the people who are walking along the shoreline. And we were talking about if you took away all the people on the shoreline, there would be no reason to go out on that boat. Like really, that is like, unless you were going fishing and you wanted it quiet, but in those public spaces, that is like a public space of interaction. And when you throw your hands up in a whoop whoop, and somebody does it on the boat, that creates a whole level of energy that is an example of the public happiness I think that you're talking about, right?
Yeah, I think it's a fairly straightforward embodied phenomenon. I don't think it just, when you try and talk about it, you're trying to evoke something that's not here. Whereas if the proof is in the pudding, it's something that you experience and you understand. And I think that's one of the big claims is that if we focus too much, which we tend to do, which is one of the claims of Adriana Cavalero, is that we tend to fall into the trap in which we allow ourselves to be in some ways pathologized, made to be lacking, made to be something. It's like, why can't I find happiness? Why am I always asking myself, am I happy? All that type of
Mhm.
linguistic, constant preoccupation with it. And the idea of some interior space in which you can find it and kind of verify it and set a metric that allows you to constantly look at it almost as like your cell phone, your battery life or something,
Mhm.
it's ultimately self-defeating. And it's not that you don't have a unique and highly individual experience of happiness. Of course you do, because you've only lived your life in the way you've done that. No one else has ever lived as you have lived. And right now, 1 second later, you're a completely more complex individual because you've spent just that atom of a second living and dwelling and experiencing all the past that you've kind of worked through in regards to your joys, your difficulties, that type of stuff. That's the real idea of humans being these incredibly amazing, complex, fully unique individuals. So that's what is not at all eradicated. That's something that you bring to bear in
Mhm.
that space of appearance. And then everybody, by doing that, creates this experience of excellence, according to Hannah Arendt's claim, which is that when you do that, you naturally kind of police yourself to a certain degree, if you want to use that term. I'm not necessarily saying that that's what she says, but you create a way in which you hold each other accountable, might be a better way of saying it, in
Mhm.
which you don't have to worry about punishing people and ensuring compliance or surveilling them to make sure all this type of stuff. It's just like you were seeing other people, and humans to a large degree want to reciprocate that type of admiration, that type of prestige, which is exchange, which seems to be an anthropological principle, is that we need to agree and earn the recognition and respect and protection of others. And so
Mhm.
that space of appearance certainly has something to do about it, which is, basically what I'm just calling being in a public place, and you don't have to
Mhm.
go there and like be breakdancing or being awesome at frisbee or something. You can just go there and sit there and play your part by sitting on the bench with dignity and
Mhm.
presence. And maybe somebody comes up to you, or a child or a dog or whatever, or you see something and suddenly you do something that you didn't plan or think, oh, I'm
Mhm.
here because I'm an engineer, or I'm here because I'm a whatever, a software technician or a professor of French, that type of stuff. You were there
Mhm.
playing your part, just because you were there with your full heartedness. And I think that's the real bold claim, and I think the useful claim to try and help us to be in the world, because that's the initiative, or that's the incentive right there, is that if we get out into the world, we largely kind of obviate, we kind of remove from our blocking our path this preoccupation with individual happiness, in which we're constantly, I think, terrorized by it. Like, oh my
Mhm.
God, am I happy enough? Am I this or that type of thing? And I'm not saying that that's not a fairly normative thing, and maybe even a largely human thing. I don't want to make any claims about that. I'm just saying that a lot of those things can be minimized in their effect, right? So
Mhm.
that you can create a more balanced, fully human experience. As I said, a thick experience. It doesn't mean that you don't have problems and insecurities and things like that. And that's why I've said before, just like riding public transportation and being in the world and also witnessing that. And like when you
Mhm.
step into the world, you realize, okay, the way you're dressed, the way that you speak when you ride public transportation, most people don't look like you, at least in places I ride it, for the most part. So you have to think about, okay, what am I communicating now when I'm not
Mhm.
saying a word? What am I learning? How am I bringing myself, how am I bringing my presence there in a way that maybe people will look at me, oh, he's white, he's male, he's whatever, this type of stuff. And they make
Mhm.
assumptions. Of course, that's what we do. But we can really complicate that and bring ourselves back to the human complexity and play and uncertainty and real aliveness and awake, being awake to life by having a full sense of presence. Like you see that people who have presence for the most part, right? You see them as a great performer and they practice it, right? They practice that type of thing, but I think they practice it through a fully embodied type of idea, being fully in the moment. Like to be a great athlete or something like that, or a great stage performer, like you have to sleep and you have to be ready to be fully alive, because the moment
Mhm.
is immense for you to go out and do that when everybody is looking at you, right? And that is something that I think we all can aspire to and break down some of those specialized distinctions about he's talented, she's super intelligent. Yeah, in some ways we all have our gifts, but we need to avoid structuring the world based on these hierarchies because
Mhm.
I would claim they're based on privilege. Other people haven't had as much of that. Society doesn't do as good a job as it always needs to do in order to help give everybody a chance to play their part in
Mhm.
a fully functioning public, And in here in the US, just personally, I mean, we waste too much money, if you want to look at it economically, on building prisons and incarcerating people. And I'm not even going to mention the moral, ethical dilemma of doing that type of mass incarceration, But if you, whatever your perspective is, it's an enormous waste of our money. It's an enormous waste of things. We can do other stuff with that if we can help to structure our society in a way that allows more people to get a chance to play a part there. Now, these are big claims. I'm not saying that there's this utopic possibility, just go out and sit in a park bench, but you play a part. And those small, in seemingly, sometimes I feel, insignificant moments and acts, they loom large. They have an enormous unseen effect. They ripple out into the world. And who knows, maybe they do help to create some type of systemic bettering of society. But in any case, they help you change yourself for the better. You be the change that you want to see in the world. Sometimes
Mhm.
these types of popular forms of wisdom. If you can do that, then you can help to experience that health, that own sense of health, and then you're probably in a better position to help those that are around you. And as
Mhm.
I would say, maybe people need you immediately. Maybe you can't change the fact that we waste too much money on this, or I don't want us to spend money on that, or I think we should vote for this person and we should give more money to the environment, whatever it is you think is important, save the whales, that type of stuff. Like, go do it, but do it out of a sense of joy. And so when you fully do it, you also have the time to be in the world because somebody may need your help right next to you. And it may be somebody that you wouldn't know that they need that specific type of help that only you can provide. And I don't even know what it is. Obviously, you just have to be there to do that. And
Mhm.
that is an ethical act, right? That is a way of being fully human. And that is a way of feeling like you have worth and you're needed in the world, which we all obviously deeply, I would say, desire, a
Mhm.
feeling of
Mhm.
need, of purpose in our life. And I think those can be accomplished in small ways that might then slowly start to build momentum towards more fulfilling ways in regards to career and family and, all the
Mhm.
other big, big questions in life.
Mhm. Well, I think that seems like a good place to wrap it up for today.
Sounds good.
Do you want to, probably not, but do you want to give any recommendation before we leave or any last moment goodbyes? We're going to go eat
No,
dinner, y'all.
yeah, no, I thank you for the invitation, and I enjoy talking about these things. So if you want to talk about it more, you can contact me, or I kind of linger on the edges of the Foot Nerd program, and I really enjoy it and I appreciate it. So probably this is destined most likely for that audience, and if others happen to run into it, and hopefully in the future we'll talk more about some of these things. And if you have specific questions, because I go fast and kind of introduce a lot of stuff, and I feel like that's one of the things I've smuggled out a lot of ideas, which I think are awesome and really great. And I love to talk about them. And so it's hard to squeeze them all into a relatively short format, but I'm happy to kind of unpack some of those or just talk about other stuff in the future. So hopefully we have the opportunity to do more podcasts and follow up in
Yeah.
whatever ways are desired and fun and useful.
Yeah. Well, we definitely will have more podcasts. And if you have specific questions you want to ask or a topic you want to unpack a little bit more or any comments at all, you can just, I guess you'll leave a comment in the comment section because this is going to go up on YouTube channel. And then if you have any questions about the Foot Nerd program, don't hesitate to get in touch with nerdhelperteam@gmail.com. And thank you. Thank you, Matthew. Let's go
Okay,
have some
thank you.
dinner.
All
We're
right.
going to go barbecue now.
Bye.
Ciao.